So listen, guys, I know most of you think of me as a fellow Gen Z comrade, but I'm actually pretty old. Not only a millennial, but an old millennial, meaning that my back hurts and I'm tired all the time, and I wonder if I'm always gonna have bags under my eyes. And you know what? Yeah, there's gray and white hairs in the beard. You might have noticed if you watch this in 4K. But compared to our political leaders, I'm practically a soft-bottomed little baby, because our politicians are, in case you haven't been paying attention, really, really old. This has been highlighted by recent concerning incidents, like when Turtle impersonator Mitch McConnell froze up during press conferences, or Representative Dianne Feinstein appeared not to remember that she had been on sick leave.
It's a reporter from the LA Times asked her about her leave, to which she replied that she hasn't been gone, that she's been there.
Meanwhile, there's an overwhelming sentiment that the potential Trump versus Biden rematch is about as of the moment as a 1950s TV dinner. With politicians constantly looking a little worse for wear, it's no wonder that Google searches for gerontocracy are spiking. Gerontocracy, by the way, is a society where the oldest members have the bulk of the political power. It's like high school, where the seniors just get to do whatever the they want. Is it still like that? I really hated high school in that way, especially being a junior, because once my house got like toilet paper by the seniors, and then I came out and I caught them doing it, and I jumped on the hood of their car to try to catch them, and they drove away and I was on the hood of the car, and then I pulled my pants down and I said, if you don't drive me home and clean it up, I'm gonna shit on your car. And then they called my bluff, and then I did it, and then a whole thing happened where the parents of that kid called my parents, and then they called the principal, and I got taken out of class the next week to talk to a principal and a dean of students, and I sat in their office, and after a minute of silence, they just said, "Boy, are you able to just shit on command?" And then I said, "I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but yes, sir, I am able to shit on demand." I loved high school. It's not just a few wizened outliers either. Today, a quarter of congresspeople are over 70, the highest percentage ever. And to be clear, I don't hate old people. I love old people. But like, man, are you really that in touch when you're over 70 if you're not Bob Weir? For those of you who don't know, Google Bob Weir. At the same time, while half of the country is 38 or under, only 5% of congresspeople are. Meanwhile, the public's trust in government is at near record lows. And increasingly, mainstream media blames this on the problem of old people in charge. So what does it really mean when our political representatives are just way older than we are? Is being led by our elders inherently bad for society? Are the shortcomings of the American political system caused by aging politicians, or is the truth way more complicated? Well, today we're gonna find out in this video, where I'm gonna ask, are politicians just too damn old? Now, from ancient Greece and China to many of today's surviving Eastern African tribal communities, rule by the elderly has been the norm. And indeed, the word Senate comes from the Latin word senex, meaning old man. Now, people haven't always been happy about this. Gerontocracy was actually coined by an early 19th century French pamphleter to criticize the country's conservative, aging parliament. There is some historical rationale for the idea that when the same people hold power for too long, it can lead to some problems. In the final decades of the USSR, according to historian Vladislav Zubak, the generation that won World War II clung to power. They were afraid to let it go. Instead, they perpetuated well-honed corruption, lived in opulence, and failed to embrace change that would put the nation in good stead. As political scientist Yelena Bieberman put it, this made politics a very stale affair, which didn't inspire the younger generations and ossified the ruling caste in place. Worse still, these old, uninspiring leaders had a very inconvenient habit of just straight up kicking the bucket on the job. This prompted Wisecrack favorite Ronald Reagan to quip in 1985 that he would have loved to summit with Soviet leaders, but they just kept dying on him. As the aging Soviet Politburo gazed out over the May Day procession each year, Americans and Soviets alike got a good chuckle at all the old guys. As for America, age hasn't been much of a concern for most of our country's existence. That's largely because people just didn't grow old enough to lead for 4 decades like Mitch McConnell. One reason the Founding Fathers didn't set a mandatory retirement age for judges was because, as Alexander Hamilton wrote, few folks outlived the season of intellectual rigor. Of course, the average lifespan span has doubled since just 1900. Over the 20th century, the age of our representation has ebbed and flowed, with times of political stability like the New Deal era seeing gradual age increases. Throughout the later 20th century, the average age remained stable until the 1990s, when it spiked from around 54 to nearly 61. Today we have the second oldest Senate and third oldest House of Representatives in history. And while baby boomers and Gen X only make up 50% of the population, they're 85% of Congress. It's not surprising that the average age of our representatives goes up as people live longer. The real question is it the problem we're all making it out to be? Well, maybe. As anyone who's ever watched their mom repeatedly type her Google searches into her Facebook status updates knows, people who didn't grow up with internet technology may be less equipped to understand it. So it's not a huge surprise that an aging Congress has been less than nimble at regulating big tech. Politicians' shortcomings in this arena have become embarrassingly apparent. Like in 2018, when Congress attempted to grill Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook's data privacy policies in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Now, many of them betrayed a complete lack of even the most basic understanding of social media.
Do you track devices that an individual who uses Facebook has that is connected to the device that they use for their Facebook connection, but not necessarily connected to Facebook?
Or when they tried to trip up the TikTok CEO.
Can you say with 100% certainty that TikTok does not use the phone's camera to determine whether the content that elicits a pupil dilation should be amplified by the algorithm?
Of course, that could arguably be fixed if representatives' patient grandchildren were willing to explain TikTok. Now, an aging Congress also has implications for diversity, as most of the people who were able to get their foot in the door did so at a time when it was a lot harder for people of color, queer people, and women to do so. For example, a Pew Research study put out in July of this year noted that there are only 2 senators of color over the age of 60. Importantly, this trickles down into the staff they employ as well, which is partly why the staff of the House and Senate remains so damn white. Further, a separate Pew survey in January found that older and younger generations have some fairly crucial differences in priorities on both foreign and domestic policy. Where older folks tend to center issues like immigration, terrorism, and the strength of the military, younger ones find climate change, education, jobs, and poverty to be far more pressing issues, and largely aren't really gung-ho about our military. You know, maybe because they're the ones who mostly actually have to do the dying when we go to war. This can cause some anxiety for young people that their representatives don't have the political will to tackle what they see as our most looming threats. And it doesn't help when sometimes those older politicians act like they just don't give a f***.
Because that is the only
that resolution will not pass the Senate, and you can take that back to whoever sent you here.
Shout out to my representative there being a huge piece of dog shit. Still, there's reason to argue that the elevated age of our politicians is less the disease and more of a symptom. To explain, let's examine a big reason why our politicians have gotten so old. They simply have been in office for decades and decades and decades, and you get it. You get what I'm doing here. Now, is that because they're so awesome at their job? Not necessarily. The truth is, though making it to the Senate or House is no cakewalk, once you're there, it's pretty easy to hold on to power, as research and government transparency group Open Secrets chronicles. They found that since 1964, incumbent re-election rates have ranged from 85 to 98% in the House. In that same time period in the Senate, re-election rates have, despite being slightly less consistent, overwhelmingly clocked in around 80% or higher, even ticking up to 100% this past election cycle. Now, this is a relatively new phenomenon. Throughout the 19th century, most congressmen only served for a few years, and it was even common for nearly half of the House to be made up of newbie members. This changed over the course of the 20th century as politics started professionalizing. You began to see representatives serving for 12 years or more, and with that, lower turnover rates. Today, it's very difficult to defeat a congressional candidate who's already in Congress. From this perspective, age isn't the cause of the problem. It's a reflection of the fact that existing congresspeople have a huge advantage. And they know it, as witnessed when old-timers like Nancy Pelosi refuse to even debate their challengers. This is arguably even more pernicious on a state level, where the redistricting that occurs every decade is overseen by the very representatives who will be seeking re-election. As journalists Grace Panetta and Walt Hickey write, state lawmakers have expertly wielded their redistricting pen to kneecap their opponents and hurt younger candidates. Over the decades, intentional partisan gerrymandering has dashed many congressional careers and aspirations. This has especially impacted young and diverse candidates. At a national level, the reality is that Congress largely rewards seniority. Longtime representatives are favored with committee chairmanships and have an easier time finagling sweetheart deals for their state, like West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd, who got his state $10 billion over 51 years. As a result, their constituents are reluctant to give up the power that comes with having a representative wielding the gavel. But it's not just the people who favor incumbents. Corporate political action committees, or PACs, spend 97% of their political donations on incumbents, hoping to get the best bang for their buck. Again, if you're not from America, we have these groups called PACs, and you can give them all this money. They don't really have to disclose who they are. And then they can use that money to just fund whatever politicians they want. And most of these PACs aren't like, our whole thing is environmental justice. They're normally just like, weapons are good and cigarettes are great for children, and guns. Also oil, guns, cigarettes. In the average congressional race, incumbents spend more money on paper mail than their challenger spends on their entire campaign. The deck is stacked against anyone trying to beat an incumbent for their seat, and the ease with which someone can occupy office for decades naturally leads to an older Congress. What's more, an aging Congress is also reflective of America's two-party system. Now, in many Western democracies, third parties, and especially green parties, provide important pathways into the political realm for younger leaders. In the US, however, not only do aspiring politicians have to pick between two partisan sides, once they do, there's a good chance the seat's already taken. Probably has been for decades.
It's taken.
Thus, the problem is less that politicians are older than God's uncle, and more that they represent that system of entrenched political power. And honestly, that isn't solely the purview of the geriatric. Those same PACs, interest groups, and lobbyists will happily get behind a youngster if they're willing to play the game and not shake up the status quo. Like young, hip Bill Clinton, who'd sax his way into the White House. Ostensibly a man of the people, Clinton caved to pressures, largely from the business sector, to do neat things, like put work requirements on welfare, deregulate the finance industry, cut social spending, disempower unions, and get tough on crime in ways that were just straight up racist and destructive. Time and time again, we've seen that new blood in political power doesn't necessarily mean new ideas. Whether it's P90X enthusiast Paul Ryan or quirky Kristen Sinema opposing raising the minimum wage, there have always been plenty of youthful defenders of the status quo. Still, it makes sense for us to feel like our interests and concerns aren't being represented when we see a 50-year age gap between ourselves and our congresspeople. But as Winslow Eric Wright argues in Salon, focusing on age as the primary dividing line between what makes a politician out of touch obfuscates the larger and more glaring thing that separates us: money. Recently, thought leader and sentient Pepe the Frog meme Elon Musk criticized our ancient leadership, saying, for a democracy to function, the leaders must be reasonably in touch with the bulk of the population. And if you're too young or too old, you can't say that you will be attached. Which is a big statement from a guy who so out of touch with the bulk of the population that he bought and destroyed an entire website in a futile attempt to get people to laugh at his jokes. A website which is now just a haven for Nazis. The fact is, 40% of the 115th Congress were millionaires, and conservative estimates put the wealth of the median congressperson at 5 times that of the median American household. Now, we can attribute some of the fact that older congresspeople are wealthier to wealth's tendency to accumulate over time, and the fact that many older folks grew up in an era of prosperity. But as Wright points out, much of the aging population of the United States either didn't benefit from that economic prosperity or are now living in financial hardship. Presumably, old folks have been eating more avocado toast than we're giving them credit for. In fact, people over the age of 65 are the age group most likely to live in poverty. Given these facts, Wright argues that we need to reframe gerontocracy as plutocracy with gerontocratic characteristics. Attributing the monopoly over power as a matter of age instead of a matter of money isn't just reductive, it's dangerous. We live in an inherently ageist society. When we represent the elderly as wielding all the power, we end up fostering apathy and even hostility toward a group that is actually super vulnerable and often really nice, and other times sneakily really racist. This has been strikingly demonstrated during the pandemic through the common refrain that we don't really need to worry about it because it's only old folks who are gonna die. It's been real, Grandma. As Wright notes, while it's true that elderly people are physiologically more vulnerable to COVID, many of those deaths have stemmed from deliberate policy choices, underpaying care workers and understaffing nursing homes, which helped enable the disease to rip through them virtually uninhibited, as well as dropping nearly all wider mitigation measures and pretending the pandemic is over. Rather than vulnerable people to be protected, we see the elderly as an aging, conservative power block holding our futures hostage, and we tap our feet waiting for them to die in neglectful hospitals and care homes. For the good of country.
Now you will go to sleep, or I will put you to sleep. Check out the name tag. You're in my world now, Grandma.
But in reality, a 30-year-old with $100,000 in student loan debt has a lot more in common with an 80-year-old struggling to make ends meet after decades of failing health and hospital bills than they do with a 38-year-old anti-woke biotech millionaire, even if he is an actual stan. Money insulates the rich from having to concern themselves with how they're going to pay for a surgery, or college, or baby formula, or a decent retirement home. They simply don't share the same concerns as regular people, and America's policies reflect that reality. Having massive wealth has an epistemological effect on a person, which basically just means that having wealth makes you understand the reality of the world in a fundamentally different way. There's a lot to say about this, and we did a full video on it, so check it out if you want. No pressure, just saying. Now, the gist, though, is that plenty of evidence suggests what we know intuitively. Very wealthy people simply have a different understanding of the world and their place in it. As such, having a patrician class making decisions about problems that primarily affect the working class doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So, would it be nice to have a Congress that more accurately reflects our population? Yes, 1,000 times, yes. But when the media chooses to focus entirely on age when it comes to representation, it obscures the most significant difference between the average congressperson and the average American. And when we're busy villainizing the elderly or actively fantasizing about their death, we're not focused on stuff like unionizing, organizing, and dismantling oppressive structures that benefit the rich and powerful, including our two-party system that operates on handshake deals and the almighty dollar and keeps people in positions of power. But hey, no matter how old you are, I want to know what you think. Are we letting these old squares off the hook too easy? Is the answer to America's problems a congressional age limit? Or is age kind of a red herring? Let us know what you think in the comments. And Mom, if you're watching, the comment box is below. Type what you think in there, click send. I'll probably see it, so thanks for that in advance. Thank you so much to all of our patrons. We will never gerrymander to redistrict our patrons out of our lives. We want you forever. Your support means a lot to us. If you're interested in getting our videos early with no ads, extra audio and video content, access to our Discord server, and if you pay enough, my home address, click the link in the description. It starts at $5 a month. If you have it and you like us, consider it. But thank you so much to all of you for being here, for supporting the channel. It really means a lot. And I say that, and you might just think like, oh, he just says that. It's probably on a prompter. This isn't on the prompter, and it really does mean a lot that you help create the space for us to tackle ideas and topics like this. We love what we do, and it's you who make that possible. So thank you. Kisses and hugs.